to announce that since this is a Vivel special session, Vivel would like to felicitate the participants before they begin. As I call out the names, Ratnaboli Ray, please. Anam, Zakaria.
It's absolutely wonderful to be back at the 5th edition of Kolkata Literary Meet. And thank you, Malavika. Thank you, Jaggo. Thank you, Vivel, because we were not expecting this. Thank you so much. So this session is on partition and women in partition. And when we think about partition, we know that there are many stories out there in the public domain, which we have been reading, and there are many stories we have been listening to. Many of us, or many of you in the audience, may have been impacted by partition. So this is a great moment, and also, you know, right after Ramayana, how this partition is pitched is very, very interesting, the session. So there are realities. One reality is the stories that are told in India. Another reality is how the stories are told in Pakistan. And there is yet another story which is perhaps, quote unquote, the real story. Now the question is there a real story? Or there are many tellings, the 4th telling and the 5th telling and the 6th telling. And for many of us, partition is ongoing because we still remember what happened with Sikhs in Delhi. We know what happened after elections in 2002 in Bangladesh. We know about Godhra. We know about 2611. So when we talk about partition, we are also the observing subjects and participating in it and the process which generated the partition. The other thing is how women have featured in partition. When we hear about partition stories, it's very interesting to see and learn about the rape, the sexual molestation, the assault, the goriness, the brutal killings, the body inscription, the lack of identity of women. And also large part of partition stories are through oral narratives. So one of the questions that we are confronted with is why we have to get into oral narratives. What is it that makes us compulsive to collect oral narratives? The other important thing is how we have constructed the notion and idea of citizenship. And Vazira's work comes into play here, where she has extensively looked at citizenship of women, and also a category of intended evacuees, which is mentioned in her work, and how that relates with property and the predicament of women. One of the observations that I have is largely psychiatry has been stunningly silent about partition. I mean, there has been so much trauma, but somehow we have not worked enough with this grief. And also there has been no public recognition of this grief. Oh, so that's good news. Welcome, Farah. Welcome. Hi.
I'm so sorry. Can I just say that I did leave the... Just a very quick apology to all of you, but I just wanted clear, I left the hotel an hour ago with the only driver in Kolkata, I think, a recent migrant who does not know Victoria Memorial or the right entrance. So I know every entrance to this place now, but the last one was the right one. So sorry.
That's okay, Farah. It's great to have you with us. Just have a drink of water. I was just setting the context, and I was just sharing some of my observation, and I was talking about how psychiatry has been silent and how there has been no public recognition of the trauma that that was experienced, and also how many of us actually, whether there has been any monument of the survivors during partition, and whether there is a need to publicly recognize this, and if there is a museum, then can we sort of resolve a bit of institutionalized enmity between the two countries, or the sibling rivalry that we witness between the two countries. So, 3 countries, yes. So now that Farah is, sorry about that. So now that Farah is here, so we will move from partition making, and also we have, just before I move on, also Srijit's film Rajkahini has been stunning in many ways. Although it is his imagination of partition, the way it has been set and located, but the most important thing is how he has brought in, weaved in the marginal women voices in the film. And I think it's very important to understand that when we are talking about women in partition, digging about the histories of partition, it's very important to know how marginalized women were treated during partition. So what we will do in this 1 hour, actually 40 minutes to be precise, because I think there would be question and answers from the audience, so I'll keep 20 minutes for that and I will end here. What I'll be doing is I'll be moving from partition making to reminiscing to citizenship, and end with Srijit, where he talks about marginalized women. Is that okay? Is that okay? Yeah, Vazira? Yeah. So Farah, given your background, one is we would like to know, all of us would like to know, that how your family has been impacted by partition, and during the, any of you can respond actually, and during the partition making, what was the woman's role? Yeah, the women's role in partition, in the making, because we hear about Nehru, we hear about Patel, we hear about Jinnah, so.
Well, I think that's quite a lot to start off with.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things about, you know, the kind of individual partition narratives, and I'll use my family to illustrate that, is exactly how, you know, across these 3 nations and territories, the effect has been felt by almost every family in some way. You know, we all have our family, you know, I won't call it mythology because it's at least based on reality. We all have our scars from it, in a way, you know, and we have the family stories, either the family stories that, you know, my parents were very young but lived through this period, the family stories that people will tell, or the family stories that people won't tell. You know, the kind of reaction has come in 2 ways, I would say. You know, one is that those who moved across those borders and you know, very reluctantly, and left all kinds of things, including a part of themselves, in their original home, have reacted by either sort of saying, well, now I'm here and I don't want to think about everything I've lost, or remained in this almost a kind of state of limbo where they still, and I'll speak about the Bengali side in this particular instance. You know, I met so many people in India who say, our family Purbo theke eschilo. You know, I mean, literally dozens and dozens of people that I've personally met. And there's always, almost always a kind of yearning to reconnect, to go back and see Dadar Desher Bari, or whatever it was, which, you know, probably isn't there anymore. But, you know, I encourage people to come because, you know, it's part of their history. It's part of our shared history. And it's part of what we need to face in order to move on. You know, what happened, what actually happened to everyone in that sense. My parents both grew up in Kolkata. So, you know, for them, our original homes were in East Bengal, but that was India, you know, so they were Indians and then they weren't Indians anymore, you know, and then they were Pakistanis and then they weren't Pakistanis anymore. So now we're all Bangladeshi, you know. But it's very strange because this is a very tightly woven tapestry in that sense. And I just want to tell a quick anecdote about, I was speaking at another Lit Fest, and this gentleman came up to me very irate and said, you know, Bangladesh should apologize to people like me. And I was a little taken aback, and I said, well, why is that? And he said, because my family used to be from North Bengal, on our side of the border, and we had to move to West Bengal, you know. So I said, well, I'm really very sorry about that, but it's still not clear to me why you feel Bangladesh should apologize. And he said, because my ancestral lands have been taken and so on. And I thought, well, I could tell him that my grandfather's house in Baliganj Park was also taken. But, this is really not about what you lost and we lost. It's about what we all lost, And I think one of the things that I would love to see come out of the partition projects and the kind of work that you're doing in the future is a better understanding in all three of these nations that actually we all suffered. It's really not about whether somebody's sense of victimhood is greater than my parents' sense of victimhood, but the fact that everyone who was involved in those movements were victims of some kind. And in fact, even the perpetrators in many cases were victims themselves. I was reading about a testimony from someone who was talking about how they were encouraged. He was a very young man at the time, teenager, I think, were encouraged to go and kill children. And he said, decades and decades afterwards, he can't forget what he did. He can't discuss it with his family, but he can't forget what he did. So, until we can accept that idea that, in fact, really everyone was a victim, and if you want to look, it's not going to be that simple to assign blame either. It's certainly not as simple as Bangladesh government, Indian government, Pakistan government. Maybe you need to go back to the British for this. But, and is it worth it in that sense, given where we are now? So I would say that, to understand where we are now, and the other question of yours, I'll let somebody else respond, because I don't want to take up all the time, about women. But I think really what we need to do in order to move on in a more healthy way, and as part of, developing better relationships with our neighbors in the region, which is so desperately needed. I think SAARC must be the most dysfunctional entity. I look at places, I look at ASEAN or whatever, and it's sort of hang your head in shame that we can't even find a place to meet, to agree to meet.
So, Anam, would you like to respond, or would you like to share about the remembering pattern that you have captured in your book?
Sure.
And what was your compulsion to do this book? I mean, why did you do this book?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. And Kolkata, can you guys hear me fine? Yeah? Thank you for the invitation, Kolkata Literary Meet. It's a pleasure to be in your city, and you've all given me such a warm welcome, so I don't want to go back at the moment. But to come back to my book, I was actually working for an organization, and I was running this oral history project for them. So I would go out every day and identify survivors living in largely Lahore, and talk to them about partition. And at the same time, I was running this exchange project between young school children in India and Pakistan. And that's something that kept kind of bothering me, was the disconnect I kept kind of facing between the two generations. And I wondered why that was happening. So I'll just give you a small anecdote and then I'll move on. As part of this exchange project, there was this one child who really wanted to come to India. We were bringing 14 students with us, and I wanted him to come as well. So I called his mother up for permission, and she said, hell no. So I said, well, why not? And she said, my father came from Kapurthala, and he lost most of his family. And I was born much later in Pakistan, but I've heard a lot of the horror stories. And my fear is that if my son goes, he'll never come back, like the majority of my father's family didn't. So I said, okay, I respect that and I accept that, that's fine. A week later, she called me and she said, he can go. So I said, well, what changed? She said, I spoke to my father and he said, what's wrong with you? He's going to my home. Why would you not let him go? He's going to be okay there. So that story for me really kind of reflected what was happening between the generations, and I really feel that as we move on from partition, as we move away from partition, there are new biases and prejudices coming in. For a lot of people in the partition generation, yes, there's bitterness, there's prejudice, there's violence that they've faced, but they also lived in a society where the other wasn't really the other. There was this codependence. But the oral histories that have kind of come down have been more linear and more myopic. So we only hear about the violence. And that's a difference I kind of find in India and Pakistan when I was doing a little bit of research over here. I feel that because Pakistan is perceived as a loss from the nation, there's more space to talk about nostalgia and the loss that people faced. I know there's a silence, I'm not denying that at all, but there's also more space. For instance, in textbooks, when partition is mentioned, it is seen as something that was taken away or that was lost, and there's grief and there's separation. In Pakistan, you don't have as much space to delve into that because it's seen as a victory. So it's perceived as a victory, it's taught as a victory, and that kind of leaves very little space for personal memories and personal losses to come in. At a private level, they're felt. There are a lot of people who talk about that grief, who've come back to India to visit their homes. You know, they'll tell me stories about drinking water from the well that used to be there at their home when they were children. But at a national level, in a collective memory, there's very little space to indulge in that. And I'm primarily talking about Lahore, of course, which is very, you know, the Punjab narrative is, like Vazira and I were talking earlier, is the dominant narrative, and the two-nation theory is very predominant and entrenched in Punjab as well. So if you express too much loss at the national level, then you're kind of questioning the two-nation theory. So you don't have that space to really do that.
So there is that sentiment of hurt again.
Of course there is, but to be able to express it, and especially for women to be able to express it, it's a completely different thing altogether. The silences are much more pronounced when it comes to women. And I can delve into that later perhaps,
Yeah.
but you keep facing this recurrent, awkward denial of history or silence about history and an inability to express the history that they've lived through.
So while there are so many silences, how do we interpret the silences and the pauses, and in that, how do we construct citizenship for women, Vazira?
That's a big question. I'm
Yeah.
not sure I'm the right person to really explore the silences around partition. I grew up in a divided family. And so I grew up always trying to cross the border, and India was never the other country. It was always very much a part of us, and I've always thought of Pakistan itself as a very Indian concept, something that really the intimacy is something that's very, very important to understand also the hurt that you were speaking about earlier. I'm always struck when there are comparative partition conferences, and you have, for example, Palestinians and Israelis there, and Indians and Pakistanis there. The Indians and Pakistanis are sitting together and cracking jokes and you know, swapping stories, and by no means feel, at least at sort of the level of intimacy when people get together, the kind of separation that you have in, even, for example, our divided Ireland, and so on and so forth, the kind of rifts that exist. I think that's changing. And so the intergenerational work that Anam is doing is probably very important, because there is a way in which partition is being remembered to bolster certain kinds of nationalist projects, and also as a narrative that can be produced and reproduced to inscribe forms of difference within as well as across national borders. So understanding the politics of remembering and grappling with it, I think, is becoming more and more urgent. I came to the project 2 decades ago, really, with this sense that I didn't know enough. If I looked at the literature on refugee studies, for instance, in the entire field of refugee studies, there was hardly an article or a mention of the subcontinent's experience. Really, we were overshadowed by writings on the European experience of the refugee, and then the refugee figures in other contexts across the globe. But the subcontinent was a missing piece back then, 2 decades ago. So I was really driven by a desire to investigate, to research, not just thinking about the stories that I had grown up with, but to go into the archives. So I was driven with my research was very much archival driven, although I did oral histories, which were very important to opening up unsettled bits that required further investigation. So much of my journey with my research was a journey of discovery, to realize that in fact, you know, people were moving for much, much longer than we had been told. That borders had been constructed, in fact, to stop people moving. That the really the question that had driven partition was resolving the Muslim minority question, and that question never really got resolved. And so when you talked about citizenship, when citizenship laws were being drafted, really the problem was no one knew who was Indian, who was Pakistani. There were people that were on the move, and so what you ended up with was a lot of people who became stateless, and a lot of people who had to fight long court cases just to establish their right of belonging wherever they ended up being. And where they ended up being was not always of their choosing, because borders were being constructed in the first decade after partition. So it was a long, as I write in the title of my book, The Long Partition, it was a long process which was made by us, made by our political leaders, by our bureaucratic process, by by people like us. So understanding that the political landscape that we live in is one that's been made by us, and therefore what unfolds from here on, we have a role to play. This history is important for helping us understand, as well as becoming political agents in shaping the futures that unfold. The Bengal borderland is particularly important, I think, for questions of citizenship and statelessness, which I think remains unresolved. We still have stateless people who are neither Indian nor Pakistani. Both states refuse to recognize them and give them citizenship. And those stateless people or people in between are important, I think, not just because one could say there are just a few left, or there are very few stateless people in South Asia, but I think that status of statelessness is one which has a lot to teach all of us who may feel comfortable, settled, secure in our national belonging, to know that that's what we call Indian, or that which we call Pakistani, or that which we call Bangladeshi. We have made them, we have forged them. They are national projects that